Thanks, everyone. Welcome to NARDAC 2024 April Forum. I'm Clara Liao, NARDAC Chair. Thank you for being with us today, and we are looking forward to communicating with you in the Q&A session. So here's today's agenda. I will give a brief update about NARDAC work. Then we will start our RDA panel discussion. We invited 6 experienced cataloging educators to today's discussion. They've done cataloging trainings to various students and catalogers for years. Some of them have worked actively since the launch of the official RDA Toolkit to develop trainings and then relevant policy documentation. I believe we will learn a lot from today's discussion. The panel discussion will start with the panelists' introduction and teaching experience sharing, and then panelists will answer 5 RDA training questions. Those questions cover most of the survey questions that we received before the forum. After that, we will open the floor to answer any questions from the audience. So please put your questions to Q&A so that it won't be overlooked in the chat box. Now we start with the NARDAC update. I will go through the first few slides quickly as they give a brief background of NARDAC. This is our current representative. Now, please note I add a time range here as there will be new representatives joining us starting in May. This is our organization role. Since we've already had NARDAC update last November, this update will mainly cover last December through this March. NARDAC received 418 comments from PCC RDA Test Committee for further review. Due to limited time, NARDAC decides to focus on 124 comments that are marked with high priority. After our analysis, 74 out of 124 relating to RDA Toolkit or RDA instructions, we've forwarded them to RSC for further analysis. 26 comments seem needing further policy discussion and have been sent to PCC RDA Communication Committee for the new proposals if PCC would like to. 22 comments mainly relate to training issues and have been sent to RDA Training Task Group and RSC Education Officer. 2 comments have been resolved while LC Data team worked on policy statements update. It has been suggested to NARDAC to expand our membership to include professionals in more geographic regions such as Greenland, St. Pierre, and Miquelon, all have representatives who can represent community needs in French cataloging or cataloging education training areas. Since last December, NARDAC has actively contacted various professional communities for more representatives. I'm very glad to announce that 2 new members will join NARDAC and starting their 2-year term this May. RSC released 2 proposals around early March. NARDAC representatives actively reached out to our communities for comments and then compiled all feedback and submitted our responses on March 22nd before the due time. NARDAC is also working on a proposal relating to solving inconsistency in the transcribed manifestation elements relating to source of information. 4 NARDAC members are involved in PCC RDA introductory training. 17 training modules have been released. Related webinars are ongoing right now, and will be recorded and then posted at LC Catalog's Learning Workshop website. What's coming next? At our June's ALA NARDAC Update Forum, we will invite RDA board members and RSC members to our update forum so that our audience will have the chance to learn more about RDA work in other regions. We heard that this year's RSC in-person meeting may be arranged in November, so to avoid the conflicts, we may move our usual fall forum in November to October. So stay tuned. If you have any questions about my update or about NARDAC, please also put them in the Q&A. We will answer them later. Now let's start our RDA training panel discussion. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I will start to introduce our panelists, our panel members. If possible, please turn on your video, raise or wave your hand so that our audience know who you are. Our first member is Adam Barron. Oh, sorry. Adam is a leader in the PCC RDA related work. He serves as the chair for several PCC RDA task groups and committee, including his PCC RDA RDA Introductory Training Task Group Chair, PCC RDA Communication Committee Chair, and PCC RDA Implementation Task Group Chair. Our second panel member is Thomas Brenndorfer. Thomas is the chair of the Canadian Committee of Cataloging, and he serves as a PCC RDA Introductory Training Task Group member, and he's also our NARDAC member. Our third panelist member is Bob Maxwell. Bob also works actively in several PCC RDA task groups. He works as a PCC RDA Introductory Training Task Group member, PCC RDA Communication Committee member, and PCC RDA Implementation Task Group member. He's also our NARDAC member. Our fourth panel member is Melanie Polutta. Melanie works at the Library of Congress as a policy specialist. She leads the efforts of launching LCPCC policy statements in the official RDA toolkit. She also works as a PCC RDA Introductory Training Task Group instructor, and she's also our NARDAC member. Our fifth panel member is Professor Louise Spiteri. And Professor Spiteri is a Faculty of Management in the Department of Information Science at Dalhousie University. We are very lucky to have her so that she can bring very interesting perspective with regard to RDA training for the LIS student group. Our last panel member is Elisa Sze. Elisa works at the University of Toronto as a metadata librarian and a sessional instructor. She's also education and orientation officer in the RDA steering committee. She works as a member at large in the Canadian Committee on Cataloging, and she also works as a PCC RDA Introductory Training Task Group instructor. So now I open up the floor to all the panel members. Can you please share your RDA related teaching experience in the past few years? Louisa, if you are talking.
So I'm wondering what sequence we're following for doing that. You want to pick someone?
How about
Might be
based
easier.
on the order, like alphabetical order based on the last name? Adam, you want to say something about yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Barron. I'm the head of metadata services at the University of California, Berkeley. So I've been involved in RDA training in various capacities over the years. And so when original RDA was adopted, I was working at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, and I helped train staff to move from AACR2 to RDA. Later on, I taught classification and cataloging at McGill University as a sessional lecturer. While focused on original RDA, I believe some of the key principles that were important for that instruction and in teaching sort of the ILS students to move, or for original RDA, I think a lot of some of those principles or what were important to me back then are still true for official RDA. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the questions. For official RDA, as Clara mentioned, I've been involved in a number of efforts related to sort of PCC and RDA training. I was a member of the PCC LRM training task group that developed training for the IFLA library reference model. I'm chair of the PCC Standing Committee on Training's RDA training task group, which Claire mentioned. We've developed 17 introductory modules to introduce catalogers to some of the changes that were introduced during the 3R project to help them get familiar with using and navigating the RDA toolkit, but also be able to understand some of the new terminology and concepts that official RDA introduced. We are currently, as Clara mentioned, in the middle of presenting all 17 modules in a series of 11 webinars. And many of the people presenting as part of those webinars are also on this panel. Phase 2 training will focus on how do we actually catalog a print book and an ebook using official RDA. And so that work is currently being organized right now. Particularly that Phase 2 will focus on using the RDA Toolkit, the LCPCC policy statements, metadata guidance documentation, and application profiles. And the last thing I'll mention, I was also co-chair of the PCC task group to test the official RDA Toolkit, which brought forward a number of training issues or problems that need to be addressed. And I think my involvement in that effort really sort of influences how I think about official RDA.
Thank you, Adam. Thomas, you want to talk
Yeah.
more about yourself?
Perfect timing. It's the moment of totality right now here. Yeah, it's very dark. It's still light. Yeah. So anyways, got to honor the moment, right? So in terms of myself, in terms of training experience, I would say I would go back maybe about 15, maybe 20 years. I think it was the introduction of RDA, the original introduction that prompted me to get out there and to help instruct and so on. I would say that prior to that, the 15 years prior to that was spent learning and relearning and learning again as I worked through different systems and saw all the different changes. So I was used to that process of oh, there's so many new things happening in cataloging. I need to get a handle on this. So I definitely wanted to see produced training material that I myself wanted to see. So I thought, why not be in the driver's seat a little bit? So I began with the Ontario Library Association, the Canadian Library Association, such as it was at the time, presentations and then some workshops. I worked out some written material such as 10 RDA and 10 easy steps, and then subsequent to that, a whole book, RDA Essentials. Big changes continued with the 3R project. And that meant another round of presentations and workshops and so on. The pandemic certainly did alter the landscape in terms of delivery of training, doing much more in terms of webinars and figuring out the online way of dealing with training, and then looking at which which is the most beneficial for users, and it's clear that's a challenge because there are some that do benefit from in-person, and there's others that benefit from virtual training. So it's challenging to think of the best ways to approach that in terms of getting material ready and understanding the audience and getting the feedback from the audience. It's sometimes difficult to pick up the feedback in a virtual session. I do have a slight preference for in-person. I do like getting that feedback from people, and also my recollection of years back of training was I would go to the training and I would walk away with this nice spiral-bound notebook with all kinds of examples and material, and it would sit on my shelf for years afterwards, and I would always consult it. And to me, that's what training was. So I'll pass the torch to the next person with that point.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And then also thanks a lot for covering the darkest moments throughout the thing. I do hope that our experience with RDA and also with RDA training can be symbolized with this scene that now is the darkest moment. Everyone with lots of questions, and we can walk step by step toward a bright future. Okay, Bob.
Yes, I think we're all distracted perhaps by the eclipse, and I mean, we had our equivalent of totality in Utah about 45 minutes ago. We only saw 50%, but it was certainly cool. And I'm afraid I'm also watching the NASA feed at the same time. It appears that if you're in Cleveland or Southern Ontario, you're getting it right now, so good for you. But anyway, I don't blame anybody in this audience for feeling a little distracted. We didn't plan this, and it isn't meant to be symbolic, but maybe it is symbolic that a bright new day is opening up before us. Okay, so I have taught cataloging in a lot of different kinds of environments. I taught at library school at the very beginning of my career. I have taught lots of workshops, webinars, which to sort of go on with what Thomas was saying, I think I have more than a slight preference for in-person, because I just haven't been very satisfied so far with the training that's happened in webinars, mainly from my point of view, because I cannot tell what's happening in the audience, whether people are getting it or not, and that's, I think, a big problem. Mostly what I have done, aside from these webinars, which I'm with Adam on practically everything on those, is staff training, also local training for like the Utah Library Association, things like that, but also written instructions, which is another kind of training. So I hope we're all looking for written materials too that will help us. So that's all I have to say. I don't have very much to say to introduce myself other than that.
Thank you very much, Bob. Melanie, you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Hello, I'm a cataloging policy specialist here at the Library of Congress, and I've been involved with the RDA training almost from day one here at LC, as I was involved in the original test of RDA and the implementation. I helped to develop and put forward the name authority bridge training for the PCC, and then also participated in developing some of the material that we used internally, especially the stuff to help teach the Ferber principles that underlie RDA, because in my opinion, understanding the theory is really, really important to putting it into practice. And so that is really one of my priorities when I try to teach it. I was involved in training the LC catalogers, even though I was one of them at the time, and have since also participated in several training sessions for official RDA, the ALA sessions that we did, the session that we did at ALA Annual this past year, and also some other presentations on the work of the documentation development, which I also somewhat consider an aspect of training on official RDA, because you got to know how to use the documentation in order to do it properly. So I am definitely going to be involved with the training that we're developing here, going to be developing here at LC. We will definitely be using what Adam is doing. In fact, I'm recording the next session in that series of webinars. But we also hope internally to develop lots of practice sessions where we will do a combination of online and in person.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. Professor Louise Spiteri, you want to introduce a bit yourself? Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, wrong button. I'm used to Teams rather than Zoom, so I'm sorry about that. We're not a Zoom institution at Dalhousie. Yeah, it is getting dark here as well. So yeah, Thomas, not going to be distracted. So good morning. Please call me Louise. I'm Louise Spiteri. I'm a professor at the Department of Information Science at Dalhousie University, and that's in Nova Scotia, Canada. So we're getting the eclipse later than everybody else because we're in the far east of Canada. I've been teaching, I hate to say this, but I've been teaching cataloging for probably about 27 years now. It's been a long time. I started as a TA at the iSchool at Toronto, and I just kind of been going through, and I'm the primary cataloging instructor. I've also been involved in teaching one of the required courses, which is the Organization of Information, which is a required course in many LIS programs across North America. And we have a course, we used to have, and I'm going to express some concerns later on, which will come up. So we do have a dedicated cataloging course. This is becoming the exception rather than the norm in many LIS programs, where cataloging courses are being essentially removed, and they are being replaced by your generic organization of information. And I think as a result, students are not getting actually a good understanding of library metadata, bibliographic description, subject analysis. It's very hard to do that in that beginning course. So in the cataloging course, we take, which is an elective course, we cover the library reference model. We look at RDA, we look at bibliographic description, authority control, subject cataloging, MARC, BibFrame, DDC, Library of Congress classification in 12 weeks. So it is one of the biggest challenges. Students keep saying we need to have 2 courses. We used to have 2 courses, and I'll explain later on how that was a benefit. Students are not exposed to AACR. There simply isn't time. We cannot do this. And that is one of the concerns that's going to be raised later on, because not having that background is a challenge if you don't have AACR sometimes to understand. We also discuss as much as we can concepts of bias in our metadata systems, such as Library of Congress subject headings, the Dewey Decimal Library of Congress, and also, this is very important in a Canadian context, we talk about efforts underway in Canada to decolonize and indigenize the terminologies and schemas that we use to describe Indigenous topics. And we also look at Indigenous classification systems, such as the Brian Deere classification. This is partly in response to the Truth and Reconciliation report. And also the Canadian Federation of Library Associations has made a concerted commitment towards decolonizing and indigenizing our knowledge organization systems. So I'm contributing my small part to that. We cover multimedia, so we do monographs, ebooks, sound recordings, video recordings, digital streaming. I encourage students to really be creative in what they bring. I had one student once bring in DNA, which I thought, okay, that's interesting. I wasn't quite sure. I've never had to catalog DNA before, but I thought, why not? Let's give it a try. We hold the class in person. I have taught it online during COVID, and we managed. We do hybrid, I accommodate. So we try as much as we can within the 12 weeks for every class to set time aside in class where students can actually build things. So we go through RDA, and every week they add extra bits to the catalog record. And in one of the assignments, they have to create 3 complete RDA records, 3 different formats. And they choose them, like they choose the items. I don't, so I mark them as they come in. And there's also another assignment where they are assigning Library of Congress genre or subject headings to 3 items. And we also have in-class exercises for Dewey and Library of Congress as well. The other thing that I do, which students find very helpful, is I create a lot of video recordings. We use Panopto, that's part of our learning system. And I have videos in which I run, and I talk out loud, like I'm creating an RDA record for this monograph, and I'm literally talking out loud as I do it. I'm sharing. If I make a mistake, great. No, that was wrong. That's the right way. Went down the wrong path. Because I want to show them this is the process you follow, that you go through it, you figure out, I did a wrong turn there. And I do that for a monograph, a video recording, a sound recording. I also do it for Mark, Dewey, and Library of Congress. And it's hours of video, but students find that actually quite useful. Also, some students are visual, they want to see things, so it gives them an opportunity. And there are, and again, the other plug I want to make, it's a bit of a challenge, is it's prohibitively expensive for LIS programs to get accounts to RDA. It costs us every year about $1,000, that's US, every year to do this. And then to get classification web is another $1,900, which we cannot afford. So that is the cheaper price for LIS programs. It's still rather expensive. And to be honest, since we are training future professionals, I was really hoping that there could be a better deal for us, because it's very expensive to maintain a yearly subscription for one course. So I just put it out there. I know it's beyond the purview of this group, but it is a concern that has been raised. And I know that smaller libraries, I'm not sure they can afford just a subscription to the RDA Toolkit. It's not cheap, right? So that's me in a nutshell. I mean, there are some issues, but I'll raise those as we go through. There are also positive things. It's not all bad. There are some also very good things as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Elisa, you want to share your experience?
Yes, sure. I won't repeat the part of the introduction that Clara has already generously provided. I will just add to it. There are some commonalities with what Louise has described for her course, with how my co-instructor and I have structured our cataloging course within the Master of Information program at the University of Toronto. So at the University of Toronto, the Master of Information program is an ALA accredited program. And the course that my co-instructor and I teach is an elective course. So it is not a requirement. Students choose to take it because they have shown an interest in learning more about the topic of creating metadata for a library setting. I apologize to those of you who have already come to some earlier version of a presentation where my co-instructor and I have talked about our teaching approaches. I'll try not to be too repetitive, but in terms of the RDA aspects of that course, we generally cover LRM in 1 week, and then RDA is only covered for the remainder of that LRM week, followed by 4 additional weeks that are dedicated entirely to RDA. We are also fans of a flipped classroom approach. So similar to what Louise has described, we have also seen the value of pre-recording short video segments that students are asked to watch as part of their required preparations before coming to class. We recognize that students are also usually taking a full course load, or else if they're part-time students, they're also working full-time. And we know students will not have watched all of the videos before coming to the classroom. So we've also had to design some of our activities with the assumption that some students will not have any kind of background. One of the reasons why we were a fan of the flipped classroom approach is because there's just so much content to cover in the space of a class. And even though we meet for 12 weeks and we have 3 hours in person each week, we felt that the greatest value with having an in-person class is to be able to interact with the students as they are stumbling through the RDA toolkit and learning to develop their cataloger's judgment. So what we were able to record in a pre-recorded lecture would primarily be anything that didn't require a lot of interaction from students. And we knew for those students who were very dedicated, who didn't maybe understand a particular concept right off the bat, they could pause, rewind, rewatch. And then when they came to the classroom, they knew that we had at least half of the class carved out for practical exercises. I didn't mention what my teaching background has been, so I think it's useful just to give you a little bit of context of where I am coming from. Like Louise, I also started out my cataloging teaching career as a TA, although at the time I was an early career librarian, so I was not allowed to be called a teaching assistant due to the union restrictions. But I assisted a first year bibliographic control course in running weekly sessions. They were like labs or tutorials for students to ask questions, work out ungraded exercises, answer questions related to graded assignments as well. And all of those tutorials were oriented around AACR2. So I feel like I had a little more intimate knowledge than I really cared for around all of the punctuation restrictions with AACR2. I don't know if anyone remembers the full stop, space, dash space. That sounds like a dance move. I have also been engaged in training colleagues on use of the original RDA toolkits, and currently I am part of a small team within the University of Toronto Library System to try to develop a program to transition our staff members and catalogers to the official RDA toolkits. As of now, I have just completed my 4th attempt at teaching with the official RDA toolkit within a master's course. There are still things that I would like to tweak to make it better and easier for students to understand. I think every iteration of teaching is just an attempt to make things flow better than the previous try. I think one of the main hurdles I have heard through my RDA steering committee work and interviews with other instructors is a desire to get it right the first time. And I just don't think that that is ever a possibility in any kind of teaching environment. So think back to how you taught AACR2, how you taught the original RDA toolkit. You probably didn't get it right the first time. It's probably going to be the same with the official RDA toolkit, but just keep in mind that there will be ways to make the process a little bit easier.
Go ahead.
That's all I had to say.
Okay. Okay, I think we've been through a roundtable in some sense about our all panel members. Before we move on to the panel discussion, any one of you have extra information for the audience?
Oh, yes, may I? I'm so sorry. May
Yeah.
I share 2 links in the chats? Now I'm hoping that these links will come through, but if it does not, I may need to ask for Jamie's help with sharing it more broadly. So I think
Yes.
my chat option only shares out to hosts and panelists.
I do hope other folks can see Elisa's 2 links. If you cannot, you may add to the Q&A part.
I see
so that
Jamie has, yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, so I'll just say one quick thing about these 2 links. So last October, I was invited to provide a presentation to educators based in Europe to talk about how different instructors might approach the teaching of the official RDA toolkit in the context of their courses or their training programs. So the first link provides you with the slide deck that I shared with that audience. The second link is a handout that we have just rolled out that again provides some tips and things to think about before incorporating the official RDA toolkit into teaching.
Great, thank you. Now I'm gonna start my screen sharing with the panel questions. Again, remind everyone, if you have any questions, please keep putting them in the Q&A part. We're gonna answer them at the end of our session. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, our first panel question, based on the different categories of learner, what does a trainer need to prepare before the training? panel members, what do you think about this question? I think it's been covered in some of your self introduction part, but further suggestions?
Well, this is Bob. I can say we need to bring a lot of enthusiasm because there's a lot of skepticism out there. The lead up to the official RDA has been so long, and many staff are now wondering what the point of the training is, because we're still not at, we're still, the implementation is still a ways off. And I actually I'm sorry to say I've had some staff say that it's boring. And so which is just, I can't believe it. I just can't believe it. Anyway, trainers need to have a lot of enthusiasm at this point. And that's one preparation is and to prepare to be enthusiastic is you have to be enthusiastic about it. We need to convey that this is really a good thing because there's a lot of skepticism right now. So I think enthusiasm is an important thing, and I don't know the magic formula to get it, but I that's what I would say about this, is that because there are people who are not feeling enthusiastic about this, to say the least.
Talking about the enthusiasm, I noticed that there are also difference between the professional catalogers and then paraprofessionals. They are totally different types of learner. How we can prepare the trainings for them?
Yeah, and I think the answer I have is actually relevant to both, because I think one of the things a trainer needs to offer as much as possible is exercises where people can work through things. A model that Louise mentioned of working through it through a recorded video is something I very much want to do as a way to give, even if you're not even doing the complete cataloging, but maybe even just a snippet. I'm going to focus on recording the title and statement of responsibility with this particular resource. Let's go through the process and give the people who are trying to learn stuff a way to get practice and quick answers because many of them are going to be horribly intimidated by the documentation. So giving them a pathway to follow is something I think will be very helpful for every type of learner.
And if I may, there's no way to raise my hand here. I'm used to being able to raise my hand, so I'm just gonna butt in. I'm really sorry. This is part of what Bob was saying. The enthusiasm is absolutely critical. I think one of the and again, my audience is a little different because they're students who are, in a way, are not that they haven't been jaded, but they haven't been exposed at all. So to them, it's completely new. A perspective that I really have them always in the back of my mind is always to remind themselves, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of creating these bibliographic records? And it's ultimately to help people find resources, evaluate resource, always keeping that end user in mind is really important, because as I said, it's very easy to get caught up in the rules. You do things this way, this way, this way, but always have to remember, why are we doing it this way? And the other thing as well that I always try to reiterate in every single thing is a mindset that the skills that students learn in this course can be applicable to actually any environment, because metadata exists everywhere. Organizations of all types create metadata records, and that was part of the point of RDA. It's not designed to be exclusively for libraries, although I don't see it being used outside of libraries, and it's a little too complicated for that. But having this mindset that always keep the end user in mind, and always the importance of telling me why this is relevant, because I think that makes it more accessible to students, the understanding that this is why we're doing this. It's important we do this. And not all students who graduate these programs are going to be catalogers. They may be supervising them, but they may be working in many different environments where the skills they learn, the principles they learn can be applied to different environments. So to me, that's really important for an academic perspective. That mindset is really important.
Great.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think maybe the phrase there, staff learning on the job, just it reminds me of something I was taught in school way back a quarter of a century ago. That at university they will teach you the theory and the basics, but it is expected that you will learn what you need to do on the job. And so going forward to learn new things, people are in the context of being in the workplace and needing to pick up some new skills and so on. So that's the audience. If we're presenting something that doesn't dramatically or fundamentally change what they're doing, then they're likely not going to be that interested, because they're going to say, just teach me what I need to know, what's changed, limit it to that. And then they'll go on. But going back to what you're learning at university are the principles, is the theory, and that really comes to the foreground when you are at the point where you're developing something new or working on a new system. Just as an example, a few weeks ago, I was in a presentation, a virtual one, with the University of Toronto Cataloging Committee, and it was about artificial intelligence. And the presenter before me was from the Royal Library of Belgium, and he was discussing the use of software through the Microsoft AI Builder to look at text strings and statements and seeing if the software can figure things out and work through some automatic classification and so on. And but he made an interesting point. He said it'd be really great if the publishers put the beside the name the ISNI identifier, because that would make his job a lot better. So looking at that, I mean, my presentation was just on RDA and thinking of here where are the possibilities with artificial intelligence, and it was a very good match with what he was describing. So in a sense, I was saying, well, here's a broader theoretical framework in which you can look at what you're working with and what you want to do with that data, and thinking of ways you can work with that data better. So that, I think that's an example where if you understand principles and theory and so on, and then it becomes exciting, because you're thinking through processes by which things can improve, by which things can be better automated, and also creating better access. The challenge was the backlog of material and dealing with digital material and so on. So having access to the training and the tools to do that more effectively, suddenly there's the need. That's a great audience to have for training, I would think. But it's almost like there is a spectrum, right? I mean, the other end of that is just people are in a workplace where there's no major change on the horizon, and they're working in a system that they've used for 10 years and it works fine. And what new mark fields do they have to learn about, and then they call it a day after that. So
I'll jump in here. Or, go ahead, Elisa.
Okay, I was going to say that I appreciate Thomas's point about the spectrum of different users who may or may not need to interact deeply with RDA. I think it's really important to try to customize the training to those different categories of RDA Toolkit users. I think in larger libraries, it's far more likely that there will be copy catalogers or staff members who interact with metadata who don't actually have to produce any new data as part of their review work. And those are also individuals who are probably less likely right now to interact with the original RDA Toolkit. So I don't think that the focus of training initially needs to target that particular audience unless the output of the cataloging work is going to look different from what they are already used to seeing. I think that the first category of trainers in a workplace environment will need to be supervisors or trainers. Anyone who has some kind of role to look up difficult situations and find answers for those difficult cataloging situations. I also want to just pop really briefly over to the challenge of teaching students who may not come into the course in an LIS program with much work-based experience. I know that sometimes educators wonder whether there is any value at all in showing these actual standards and tools to students when they're not really going to retain knowledge of instructions after they finish the course. And I understand that concern, but I think that there is still value in introducing those standards and tools to the students, because the goal isn't necessarily to churn out experts in 12 weeks. That's just not realistically possible. But what is possible is showing students the breadth of resources they have potentially available to them, and also to teach them how to start thinking through a cataloging situation like a cataloger. Unless they are coming through this course, they're probably not going to encounter any other situation where they can interact safely and intimately with a standard, and know that there is an expert who can give some responses back to them. Adam?
Thank you, Lisa. So building on sort of what other people have said, I approach this sort of in two, or the first way is sort of like, who's your learner and what's the learning outcome that you need to do, because it's very different. And as Elisa was talking about with students, my approach has always been they're going to be the people who are leading or setting policy decisions, making decisions for their institutions likely. So they need to sort of have a basic foundation, but I don't expect them to really have like a really solid understanding of the instructions, because the instructions will change, things will change over time, and they need to be able to adapt to it, but they need to be familiar with the tools that we're using so they can look it up and feel comfortable doing it. So that was sort of my approach with students, really, is to make sure that they feel comfortable so that when they're in that situation, they can learn it on their own, because there may not be someone who is there to teach them. And that's based on sort of my experience alone. When I was a student, we were taught cataloging, and then I got my first professional position, and everything I was doing was nothing that was covered in the program, but I had the foundation and the knowledge to build on that. And so that was sort of my approach to it. Going into it was teach them the foundations and where to go for information to be able to answer their cataloging questions. When it comes to staff, what's their role specifically, and what do we want them to do? When we think of original RDA, we're talking moving now from original to official RDA, but how many of our staff actually regularly consult the original RDA toolkit and are able to find their answers there? Probably less than what we think or what we would hope for. And I think that's been one of the challenges that's come up now, is people are cataloging using RDA, but they don't necessarily have the foundational knowledge that we may expect. So moving to original RDA may be a little trickier for them, because they're just focusing on what's different from like ACR2 to RDA, but they don't actually understand the foundation of RDA that we may have expected. So I think that causes a problem for some people, but it may not actually be an issue, because if our goal, if we're looking at copy catalogers or something else, we can look at what do they actually need to do? What documentation do we have? Do we have local documentation for our catalogers now for original RDA, and how do we adapt that for official RDA? And it may be able to actually be a very smooth transition for a lot of the staff. When it comes to actually teaching, if you want people to actually understand RDA, one of the things that I've always focused on is focus on RDA first. So if we're recording, let's say, a title proper, focus on the RDA instructions. How do we determine that value for the title proper before we even think about how do we record it in MARC? I feel like oftentimes catalogers think of, well, how do I record this in MARC? It's like, well, first you need a value to record before we think about how we record it in MARC. And so that was always my approach in terms of exercises too, is don't even worry about MARC first. Let's get the value for the element. And then the second part of the exercise is, how do you record that value in MARC. And I think that goes for both staff and students. If you really want them to understand RDA, is focus on the RDA part first, and then how do you record that, whether it's MARC or BibFrame or Dublin Core, whatever, always start with that RDA part first.
Great. Thank you. We can move on to the next question. The next one is, what are the most challenging aspects of training with the official RDA toolkit based on your training experience? So as an experienced trainer, what's the most difficult part or challenging part for you? The new terminology, data structure, concept?
The toolkit itself and how it's organized. All the other stuff could be managed comparatively easily, but the fact that the toolkit itself no longer has that basic concept called the table of contents, confuses people beyond belief. People will get familiar with it. Eventually they'll get comfortable with it. But the interface of a book that they're used to having is no longer there. And that is the most challenging aspect of how to teach people this new content. How do you find what you need? How do you navigate from one concept to another? The incredibly decentralized nature of the toolkit is the biggest challenge.
And I think if I could add to what Melanie's saying, it becomes even more complicated when students don't have AACR's background, because there is no prescribed order in the toolkit. Like the original toolkit had, you know, those horrifically long rule numbers, which is great, but there was a prescribed table, you know, this. Part of the challenge is that, again, with an audience that hasn't been exposed to AACR, here's the standard order of elements. The RDA toolkit, where do you begin? Like, there is no prescribed order. So it's extremely frustrating. So what I do is I create a template of RDA elements following the kind of typical sequence you will find in a bibliographic record. So I think not having a prescribed order, and one of the biggest complaints students have is RDA is not prescriptive enough. It leaves a lot of guesswork. So that is one of the biggest challenges students have. They don't know where to start. So I have to give them a whole bunch of breadcrumb trails and the template say, this is the kind of the normal order in which elements go. So for me, there's a double error here that RDA presumes knowledge of AACR, but for how much longer it couldn't make that assumption. And when you have a new generation of professionals coming through who don't have that exposure to AACR, this is an increasing challenge. So that's one of the biggest challenges that the students mentioned with. There are others, but I'm just going to stop at that for now.
And a good example of that actually is, and it's not, it happened with the original RDA. It's how in a MARC record you encounter the 300 field, and the middle part of it is completely somewhere else. It's not very near. It's often the expression rules instead of with the manifestation rules.
That's right.
And so this has been a problem even since the beginning of RDA, the organization, but it is a big challenge with everything being just atomized and kind of not thrown to the winds, but I think I've even in original start RDA, I always tried to teach people to think about the Ferber entities, which are still there, and think about describing each one separately. And there isn't, that organization is still in official RDA, but it is very hard to define. And so I think that is certainly one of the most, I agree, that's one of the most challenging aspects is the kind of perceived lack of organization in the toolkit.
Yeah, I'm just going to add that examples and application profiles, we need more of those. I do remember thinking it was maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. It felt like you know, if we were at a marketplace and presenting RDA now, there would be missing wares to sell to the audience, right? Because we need something more concrete in terms of application profiles and examples, because the toolkit is very decentralized and so on. I guess more recently I've been thinking about what's gone into the toolkit in terms of what it's based on, in terms of its design, in terms of its technical writing kind of structure. I guess what's called the component content management system, data, and things of that sort. It might be helpful if that is also explained, because the more I think about it, I mean, it does have a use and application for granular and scalable and reusable components, if that is what's needed to do a certain job. So even to create examples, I'm thinking maybe good to have training material that is kind of based on that idea of recycling tasks and to-do items and instructions that apply to a number of different examples. So the toolkit itself, the way it's structured, it's different. It requires to wrap one's head around, so to speak. But there is a rationale to it. There is a purpose to that, and it's a part of what we have to deal with. It's a part of what really should be part of the explanation to students as to what's going on and why it's used, and also what's needed to build upon that and to go further, because clearly more is needed. We do need the application profiles, and we do need the examples. So,
and if I may add to that, Thomas, the examples are in the RDA Toolkit use the old one. They need to update their examples because they're based upon the original RDA Toolkit with all the rule numbers. So it's a little, but students have noted, it's a little disappointing that the RDA Toolkit examples that they provide are based on the old version rather than the official version. That's a very simple thing. I've been waiting for the past 3 years for them to change that. It hasn't happened. And examples within the toolkit itself are extremely unhelpful because they give you a snippet. They don't give you the context within which this exists. So the students don't find those examples very helpful. So I think for me, that's an area that students feel frustrated that they don't get very good. The examples, they kind of say, for the amount of money it costs to subscribe to this thing, could they not have given us examples that are a little up to date? So that's just a little complaint that they need to be updated.
If I can just sort of add on to that, there is actually an examples working group that has been put together as of last fall. And the examples editor is chairing that group, and they do meet on a regular basis once a month to try to collect new examples to input into the RDA toolkit, and to potentially update ones that maybe look out of date. I know that the examples editor welcomes suggestions. There is the feedback form that can be used through the RDA toolkit website. I believe there was a pretty wide call for volunteers, but I understand there's always the time commitment component as well. But yeah, stay tuned. I'm pretty confident that there will be more examples coming soon in the toolkit.
And are you talking, Lisa? Sorry, are you talking about, because I'm also talking about the examples in the learning resources before you actually access the RDA toolkit.
Oh,
we have complete
I apologize.
Records.
Yes.
No, you have in the learning resources, we have complete RDA records. They are using the old RDA with all the rules. Those really need to be up, because that's the only place where students can get, this is what a complete record looks like, but it's using the older version of RDA rather than the official version. Those need to be updated.
Yeah, that has been discussed with the examples working group. I'm not the examples editor, so I don't want to speak on her behalf.
Okay.
But I just know that that has come up as a potential item to tackle. Also, I believe the website is undergoing some updates. So the learning resources, the way it's set up, will most likely change in the near future. If I can maybe just share a few observations I've had around challenges of providing training with the official RDA toolkit. I agree that on the surface, RDA instructions don't seem prescriptive enough, but I also feel like part of the shift from the original toolkit to the official toolkit reveals how much we in the North American environment has tended to rely on one single place to look up instructions, and not recognizing up until now that there are a lot of decisions that we've made that have been very community centric. And in this effort to internationalize the content standard, there are things that, as you have probably all observed, have been removed from the base text of RDA and moved into other community resources, or that communities like PCC have taken on into integrating into their metadata guidance documents. I think that it also reveals that perhaps there are practitioner groups that have not in the past been used to looking outside of the main toolkit for answers. And I think that as trainers and educators, part of our role is to broaden students and learners' perspective, make them recognize that it isn't just this one toolkit that they will need to observe. They also need to know, okay, for this particular type of material format, what are the best practices and how do you know? Where do you go to look up best practices? I agree with Bob's comment about the value of referring to FRBR. Although I try not to use the FRBR abbreviation now that there's LRM, I try to emphasize, oh, when you're analyzing a resource in hand, try to figure out what is the work entity, what's the expression entity, what's the manifestation entity, what are truly properties of item as opposed to properties that are applicable across all of the copies that may exist of this manifestation. And I think for new learners, it can be hard to wrap one's mind around what is an entity versus what is a property or an element. It's not a perfect solution, but I really try to root students' analysis of the resource in the entities and the potential properties first before we try to look up instructions within the RDA toolkit. I also hear Thomas's point about the value of basing some initial decisions around the application profile. So like Louise, my co-instructor, and I also have a list of elements that we suggest to students as sort of their starting points before they begin to create their metadata description sets. The last thing I also wanted to mention is the importance of the guidance chapters. You might not want to assign all of the guidance chapters to your students to read, especially ones that are on really complex concepts like diachronic works. But as an instructor, I found them really invaluable to solidifying my understanding of concepts and terminologies that crop up throughout the toolkit. There are also guidance chapters that talk about how to just understand the syntax of the RDA language and to pick up on visual cues around, say, italicization, links that are embedded within the text. And I just cannot emphasize enough the value of reading through those guidance chapters first.
One of the things, I'll just go back to what people were saying before about the challenging aspects and the structure. People during the test, this came up too, people didn't know where to start. My hope is that with an application profile that sort of lays out the elements, that really provides a really good foundation or starting place, because that was something that was lacking for the test. So using the application profile as a way to sort of identify what elements you could record. The other thing, which is I think a really big advantage for the official RDA toolkit, is it is highly structured. Every element page has the same basic structure. There's a lot of repetition through the toolkit. If you're familiar with it, if you look at it enough, there's so much repetition throughout the toolkit, and using it as an advantage as you're teaching to identify what certain pages look like and where things are, so people can just sort of easily get through it. During the test, it came up a lot. People were confused by certain instructions, like record this element as like an appellation of this element. And then they got into this rabbit hole of all the other things they can do, where that instruction is just a very basic thing, just saying, oh, this element can be recorded as like a name, an access point, an identifier, and all of that's explained below, but they got caught up on that one instruction and got into this huge rabbit hole of all the other stuff that wasn't really relevant to it. So understanding the structure and where the boilerplate text is throughout and how to use it to your advantage while teaching, so you don't have to identify or learn thousands of elements. A lot of it is very much repetitive throughout, but understanding that basic overall structure, I think, will be really helpful to understanding RDA overall.
Yes, and Adam, that's something that even under RDA, the very original RDA, a difference from AACR2 is that I've tried to teach people, if you learn to do RDA, you don't need special training, particularly to do a DVD versus a codex, because the rules are the same for everything. And so, and that's sort of symbolized by what you said, Adam, about the extreme, I guess, normalization of every single element in the official RDA. That makes that point even clearer, that this doesn't apply to just one kind of things, it applies to everything. And that's just about every single piece of guidance in the whole toolkit applies to any kind of material you might have.
Great.
Another thing that I think the students struggle with is actually the language the toolkit uses. The language can be very, it's not what, it didn't sound like what people actually say every day. Like, the language is very specific. And as a result, I don't find the search engine is very robust, I'll be honest with you, because unless you have the exact nomenclature of RDA in the search engine, you often won't get the results that you need. So part of what I do is, again, the breadcrumb trail, these are the actual terminology you need to be using to find X, Y, and Z, because so it's the language that is used, the nomenclature is sometimes a little intimidating to students, because they say, couldn't they have said this in plain English rather than these rather convoluted sentences? Again, I'm just telling you what they're saying, and this is year after year, I get the same story. And because of that, they often have a hard time negotiating the search engine, because they don't know what terminology to use to get to the element that they need. So for me, that's also a problem with the language. It's difficult to negotiate.
Thank you, Louise. Let's move on to the next question. Actually, with regard to the language, it's kind of similar to the previous question. What are the most challenging parts of the official RDA toolkit based on your learning experience as an RDA trainer?
I'd like to just continue on with something Louise was saying. I was in this particular slide, I was going to say, I have written down language, but it's not only the vocabulary, but it's the style and grammar. I mean, there's this sort of special style and grammar that RDA uses that is not really English, and so trainers need to carefully look at a few elements together with the people who are being trained, and say, okay, this is what, when it says this is what it means. I mean, when it doesn't use the definite and indefinite articles like you might expect it to use, for instance, and there are very strange ways of putting things. And so once you understand this, then you'll be able to understand it throughout the toolkit, but until you understand it, you won't get it. And so I think it's both the vocabulary, but it's also the style and grammar of the whole thing.
Yeah, and that is part of, I think, one of the challenging parts in training is one of the things that is important to convey is there's a reason for this. They weren't doing this because this was the natural way that the writers of the toolkit talk. They don't. But they were trying to do something for an international standard that can be translated comparatively easy into many languages. And that has an impact. It cannot be easy to understand in English if it's then going to be easier to translate into many different languages. And there are still problems with the translation process. So that, I think, is part of what we as trainers might need to be getting across to people. I understand you're frustrated with this. They did it for a reason. And I think the reason is one you might understand and empathize with. So repetition, eventually you'll get comfortable with the terminology and be able to find what you need. But there is going to be a learning curve. And that is one of the challenging things to get across to people. That yes, it's set up this way. Yes, it uses this really weird language in places. Yes, it's incredibly repetitive, blah, blah, blah. All these other things. Yes, but there are reasons that these choices were made. And it is meant to make it usable by many, many people across the globe, not just your community. And so that is a hurdle to get across in training. But I think it's an important foundation for them to understand that, yeah, you're going to have to pay for an international standard by not always understanding it very easily. But eventually you will.
I think it's worth pointing out, though, I certainly do when I'm training, that RDA is not above criticism.
No, it's not above criticism at all.
And that the language is not above criticism. And if you feel, you as a person who's being trained, feel that there's something that could be worded better, there is a process for changing RDA. And so I think that's worth telling people that, you know, we did not bring this down from Mount Sinai on 10, you know, on 2 tablets.
You can't complain about it at all. No.
This is not above criticism, and things can be changed if there's a way to make something better in RDA. And I think that's certainly worthwhile emphasizing to people as we train.
And I'll add another challenging part to it that really has to do with the history of how cataloging has changed over time. When I came into cataloging, we had been doing AACR2 at that point for over 20 years. The documentation was developed in depth, and we had answers to almost all questions except for really edge cases. So the answers were there to be found if you really searched for them in almost every situation you could come up with. With the RDA Toolkit, the transition to original and then now to official means that some of that documentation no longer exists in depth. As one of the people who develops the documentation, I can tell you right now, there's still stuff missing, not only in the toolkit itself, but also in the supplementary documentation that we continue to develop. So this is one of the challenging parts of training, because sometimes somebody's going to ask a question, and I'll say, well, I know where to find the answer in the old documentation, and lo and behold, I've just discovered it doesn't exist in the new. So this does make teaching a little challenging when you have to tell them, oh, we have to go develop that first. So that is, for me, one of the more challenging parts of doing training right now.
One of the things that came up during the test that we haven't talked about yet is the application of options, because the official RDA toolkit has lots of options, and there's policy statements that say apply the option, apply the option, apply the option. And it's a different way of thinking about and sort of getting a value for an element, because one of the things that came up during the test, people were like, oh, I came across an option, I applied the option, and they thought they were done. And it's like, no, you apply that one, but you need to apply these other options as well. Just because you applied one option, you're not done. So it's getting people to sort of understand how to navigate all the different options and how they should be applied, particularly in cases where sometimes the options may be in conflict with each other in terms of the RDA instructions. You can't, I think the clearest example I can think of, there's an option where you include the initial article or where you omit the initial article. Well, you can't apply both options to the same value. So, but you need to make a decision, and this happens throughout the RDA toolkit. And so that's a whole other way in terms of how we approach training for the official RDA toolkit, is how to not only read and understand the language of an individual option, but how do we use the options and build on them to get a value that we eventually record.
I'd like to respond for a second to what Melanie was saying about the extensive documentation. I think one of the most challenging parts of official RDA Toolkit, actually maybe this is teaching the previous slide, but is getting people to understand that you don't need an answer for everything. I mean, the documentation was extremely in depth before, and it was even more so in AACR2. And one of the points about RDA in the first place was to get people to think about the principles that they're following. I mean, like, for instance, well, let's help the user, for instance, or I mean, when RDA first came out 10 years ago, and I was sort of the expert at BYU, I had a line of people coming up to my door every day and saying, look, RDA says this, and it says I can do this or this, what should I do? And I would say, well, what do you think you should do? And then they would think about it, and then they would say, well, I think I should do this. And I would say, well, that's what you should do then. But I think we need to, I mean, I'm not, the word isn't disturbed. I'm a little concerned that we're trying to answer every possible little question with documentation and application profiles and things, when in many cases, if not maybe most cases, we should be saying, all right, people, think about those principles which are laid out at in one of the guidance chapters. Applying this principle, what do you think you should do? And if that means sometimes people make different decisions, well, that's okay, probably in many cases. Anyway, so I think that's been a challenge to me, is to get catalogers. I've been trying for a decade now to get catalogers to change the mindset that I have to be told in every instance what I need to do, and I need a policy for every last little thing, when they don't. They need to be, using their brains and thinking about, well, what am I trying to accomplish here? This was, we said that earlier. I mean, what am I trying to accomplish? Why am I doing this? And that should guide my answer to what I'm going to do in this particular instance. So I'm not criticizing anything you just said, Melanie, but I'm just pointing out that I hope that people stop feeling like they need to have the documentation tell them what to do in every possible situation.
And I'm going to add to that, Bob, because that's interesting, that the dichotomy of that approach, because on the one hand, students get frustrated initially about, I wish it'd be more prescriptive, but then they realize, hang on a minute, there's a value to not being that prescriptive, because it allows the notion of catalog as judgment. And students are all surprised by how much judgment is involved in creating cataloging records. And they do find that the PCC guidelines are very helpful, because that really helps sometimes disambiguate. But they're interesting because on the one hand, they would like to have, I think they come in expecting to have a very prescriptive, this is what you shall do under all circumstances. Once part of my job is to give them the confidence to make decisions, to say based upon the principles. Once they get kind of used to that, they actually say, you know what, it is actually pretty good in that regard, because they allow that flexibility so that you can think about what your environment needs, what your clients or user base needs, rather than it must always be this way. So I think it's really interesting to see the light bulb go on as they progress through the course. So they realize, I actually can make some judgments. There might be some variance in record 1 to record 2, but is that variance going to make a heck of a difference to the end user at the end of the day? So I always tell, with the user perspective versus the cataloger perspective, they're not always serving the same purpose. So I'm going on about this, but you trigger that thought, and seeing that light bulb go on amongst the students is actually really wonderful to see.
Yeah, I like that expression, the light bulb moment, because I think that is a challenging part of the toolkit and the way it's presenting things. And among the light bulb moments would be the fact that everything is represented as elements. Mm-hmm. The label that you see, the reference label, is not for public consumption. It's just a signpost for you as a cataloger to say, I'm making a decision, right? Mm-hmm. The next light bulb moment is the definitions are the reasons you're recording a value. So everything that was distributed throughout AACR2, the various instructions, are all encapsulated in elements and in the definition. The reason you record anything is captured that way. the convoluted language comes to play when you see instructions that say, record the value of this element while you're recording another element, like a name used for an access point. Well, I'm not actually recording that first element, so what's it talking about? No, it's a way of thinking about what you're doing, and maybe the confusing thing, the fact that it's presented as an element set suggests this is how you are to encode it right off the bat, perhaps in some sort of linked data, metadata statement framework, when that's not at all what you're using. You're using something where you're taking a lot of the resulting values and encoding them in this particular way for this particular presentation purpose. So people are living down in that area where they're dealing with results and presentation and encoding systems, but the toolkit is presenting everything in terms of elements and definitions and metadata statements and metadata description sets and so on, when that doesn't appear real to people in many ways, but it does represent a logical and consistent way of going about things. The fact that elements produce metadata statements means you have to make a sentence as to what you're doing. This manifestation has title proper, this value. You're going to take that value and use it in another element. And the instructions actually say that, even though that's not an encoding instruction, that's a mental process that you have to go through. I think that's a challenging aspect of the toolkit, is going through that whole cycle of explaining what's going on here.
Thank you, everyone. We're gonna move on to the next question. So for each of the question, we spend around 15 minutes, and then I do hope we have some time for the Q&A part. And audience, please keep posting your questions in the Q&A. Even at the end, we may not be able to answer all of them. I will check with the panel members to post their questions to all the questions we post their responses to all the questions we received, and then also post it in our NARDAC website. So we will see this positive question. What are the most interesting parts that you've noticed during your official RDA training? This could be very short response throughout all the panel discussion, but I'm curious, any positive or kind of interesting sign you've seen through your official RDA training?
Maybe one of the expressions I've heard for many years is, well, RDA or even AACR2 says this, but we want to do this. As if this is the rule book and it's top heavy and it's telling us what to do. But it's patently obvious that when everything is presented as options, it's not doing that anymore. The onus is on you or the community that you're a part of, or the institution, to develop a profile based upon the options that are available. And along with that is that in the past, even in the official toolkit, it would say record the preferred name, and it would leave it at that. And maybe you want to record an access point. Well, and before that, you would be breaking the rules, or you're creating an exception, etc. Now it's just an option, and you pick the option that is appropriate for your application and your implementation. The idea of putting back into the toolkit the constraints and limitations of whatever system you're working with, as if that has to be the rule that everyone else has to follow, that the toolkit's not going to do that ever. It does mean that it looks very open-ended and not as definitive as what people want, but it also represents these moments when people are saying, well, I've always recorded it this way. Does RDA allow me to record it a different way or a different method? And oh, look, it's an option. It's a different recording method or something like that. And then they just have to develop a policy. In the past, people would have had to go through the rule revision process potentially, right? They would say that we have to go through this long, convoluted process to change the instructions, right? And often the change would be add an exception or an alternative, or you know, and or it would end up in the LCRI and the rule interpretations, which is a voluminous piece as well, which a lot of those would just simply be an alternative and exception, or just the following a different option from one particular set way of doing something. So I think that's interesting, is to see that transition in people's minds occurring. And I think it's going to be a slow process, because I think habits are you know, deeply formed. The expectation is that these are rules. You know, I'll sneak away and change it and do this, when that's not actually what's going on anymore.
And my perspective, again, because the advantage of having students is they haven't had that, they don't have that baggage coming in with them and what's been done in the past. So one of the things that the students find as they experience in their training is they really appreciate the fact that they carefully consider the principles of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And they really appreciate how the value that a well-constructed metadata record can bring to the end user, and to see that ability, that they recognize that. So I think what they appreciate about it's not the toolkit, it's also, of course, the way that the instruction takes place, is that it really forces them every time to examine the principles and what is important. And rather than, because I know with AACR, you would get caught in the minutiae of space, colon, heaven forbid you have a colon rather than the semicolon. There's all these things which, frankly, at the end of the day, how important are those things to the end user anyway? So I think for them, the fact that with RDA, you're taking a bigger concept look at what you're doing and the principles you're trying to extract. And they appreciate the fact the toolkit allows them that flexibility of thinking about the why, thinking about the principles, rather than they get mired in, we must do it this way because. So again, initially they're a little nervous about that lack of prescription, but as they go through it, they realize this is why we're doing what we're doing. And the toolkit allows them the flexibility to think carefully, make intentional decisions about what I'm doing, rather than just being rule bound.
I'll kind of echo this, because this is one of the things that, as we started developing the documentation, took me by surprise, which is that the minimum requirements of a record in RDA Toolkit official is really minimal. Really minimal. I mean, people underestimate how minimal a record can be, still be an official RDA Toolkit record. All the other stuff we record is the stuff we want to record because we think it's valuable. So in that sense, I think that's actually one of the more interesting parts of working with the official toolkit, is that seeing, yeah, you can get by with a bare minimum, but we really want to add value. As catalogers, it's part of our whole job, is to add the value of the information, and we enjoy doing it. We just need to know how to do it quickly.
Okay, we can, with limited time, if no further response to this question, we're gonna move to our last one, which is quite challenging. Speaking to the major differences between the original RDA Toolkit and the official, how have you adjusted the training you provide? And do you have any further suggestions for how trainers themselves can adapt and then to train others to use the official RDA Toolkit? We've covered some of the parts even back to the AACR2 time, but right now at this moment, any suggestions from the panel members to our audience?
I'll note two things. One is that some things haven't changed of how I would teach, in that vocabulary changes. That was a part of the transition from AACR2 to original RDA. I think vocabulary changes is once again going to be one of those fundamental things you have to teach from original to official, because the standards constantly change and vocabulary is part of that. And similar things like that. But one of the things that I do think, and I think Louise actually kind of mentioned this in how she prepared stuff for her students, is that you need to give them a framework.
Mm-hmm.
Because the toolkit has become so decentralized and no longer has that table of contents,
Mm-hmm.
we need to give the students, whether they're professionals or brand new to it,
Mm-hmm.
some level of a framework in which to approach the new toolkit and how to find the information they need. Because, you know, as we just said in the last answer, now everything's an option and the minimum requirements are really, really minimal. So now we need to tell them, okay, yes, here's your bare minimum, but here's what we want you to record. Go forth and find. And giving them that framework is, I think, a really valuable part of what training in general and training for your specific institution is going to be very necessary.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that trainers are going to need to do, because the original toolkit, and these here too, but the original toolkit was presented in at least it had its own logic about what it thought the logical sequence of activity, the workflow should be, and that's not there at all in the official toolkit. We trainers, when we prepare training materials, whether it's for an in-person or a webinar or some sort of written material, we're obviously going to have to, I don't think there's any way around it. We're going to have to decide what we think the logical sequence for whatever task is that we're going to train people to do. And so we need to, that's one thing that we're going to have to adjust our training, is that we have to ourselves, we as trainers, as teachers, professors, I mean, we have to think about to ourselves, what do I think the logical sequence is going to be? Because I can't just stand in front of the group and say, well, randomly, let's look at this and that. I have to present it in a particular order, because that's just how training works. So that's a kind of a major difference. I mean, in previous training, we could somewhat just say, okay, let's go through RDA in the order that it's in, and now we have to think about it. What is the order that I'm going to train this in, or do this training in?
I'll say,
Sorry, go ahead first.
To build on to Bob's point about the order, I think the order, in terms of how the order of elements, I guess, that you present them, that may change based on your audience and the tasks that you want them to do. Because I think in terms of like original versus copy cataloging, if I'm doing copy cataloging, I'm probably going to go down in mark tag order. But if I'm doing original, I'm not starting with at the top. I'm probably starting with the 245, like in terms of how I would do it. So I think there is a difference based on the tasks that people are performing, how you order or structure that information.
I agree. And like you, Adam, we learn how to do RDA first, mark later, because I don't want the mark to structure. I use a template simply because I want to have some consistency in the records when I'm marking them, so that I can kind of go in a certain way. But to your point, absolutely. I always tell them that the order of the record will vary depending on your need. So one of the things I also have them do is also question, the rules may say do it this way, but is that necessarily the appropriate for your need? So always, I always tell the students, I teach you the rules so you can learn how to bend them or break them when necessary, because sometimes you need to have that creative approach. And I also provide, because one of the challenges, and when we do the LRM, unlike you, Elisa, we do it in one class, so it's kind of rushed, is it sometimes, although intellectually they understand the difference between, work, expression, manifestation, and item, I actually create a little flow chart to show them these elements go under manifestation, these go under. It just helps them, because the toolkit is so overwhelming, it helps them kind of, once they become familiar, they'll know where to go. But the students find it really helpful to go, okay, at this point, I'm looking for the expression rather than the work. And then after a while, it kind of gels in where they don't need those tools. But I find it's useful. What I try to do is to minimize as much noise as I can, so that they focus on the principles rather than caught on, hang on, where does this label go now? Because sometimes they get too fixated on those things. They can't see the wood for the trees type of thing. So I try to disambiguate as much as I can so they can focus on the really important things.
Just to add to what Louise has said, I feel like part of my job as an instructor is to help reveal to students that every cataloging decision they make is based on a principle or some theory that we have read or learned, even if they don't want to acknowledge it.
That's right.
So even something as basic as choosing to transcribe a value from the manifestation that they're trying to catalog, there's a decision made there to transcribe as opposed to structuring it in a particular way. So I want to make sure students understand, okay, why are you copying as opposed to providing me with an access point? Why are you separately recording an access point for this particular agent or for this particular work? What are the principles that can be fulfilled? So transcription, it's about representing the resource. Providing access points, it could be about collocating resources so that users can fulfill that explore task that's talked about in LRM. Search functionalities, finding, identifying. I really try to bring the LRM user tasks in periodically so that students always have that in the back of their minds. I, like Louise, also want to tease apart the content standard decisions from the encoding scheme. So I also reserve mark for the later part of the course, after students have done the descriptive cataloging using RDA, have looked at subject analysis, how to perform subject analysis, assign subject headings, assign classification notations, and then finally sort of wrap all of these parts together within a mark structure. But in our last class, we also tried to prepare students for the possibility that one day they might not be working in a mark environment. And in fact, I know anecdotally from students that sometimes their first cataloging like project when they graduate is to help organize some private organization's collection. And they don't have a mark system to work with. They just have Microsoft Office with Access and Excel, and they have to make some sense out of that. So I think this is where understanding principles, understanding representation, identification, collocation is all really helpful.
There's one question actually in the survey I noticed also fitting to this category, especially when we started the original RDA toolkit, our training environment in majority of the cases kind of in person or classroom teaching, while official RDA toolkit launched December 2020. And then since then, we've experienced at least I've observed the different like in-person and then also purely online webinars. Based on panel members' experience, do you think which approach would be more effective or hybrid type of a session would be the most effective approach?
I would definitely go for hybrid for a variety of reasons. One is there's a lot of foundation that you need to lay, and you don't necessarily need to do that in person. That is something people can do at their own pace with pre-recorded videos or pre-reading, as long as they'll do it, which is another question. But there still needs to be, if at all possible, an interactive part where people can ask questions, especially when they're interacting with actual resources and doing exercises. That you can't necessarily just leave them alone to do, because that's where they're still fumbling and getting their feet under them. And that's where you need the person who's right there to ask and answer. So I think hybrid is definitely going to be the way I would prefer to do this, so that they can have the lecture at their own pace, and the one-on-one or the small group session can be the place where you actually work with stuff and get your questions answered.
If I may, when we had to switch to fully online, that was, I really struggle with that, because cataloging is teaching it online when you have the hands-on component is really challenging. But what we did is we created, because I always encourage students when they're creating RDA records to actually work with a partner or somebody else, because they can share ideas and have that conversation, and discuss the principles. I had them work in kind of breakout groups, and then I would actually I would visit each group and say, how's it going? Do you have any questions? There are opportunities we can insert yourself in a hybrid environment. So we actually surprisingly managed to do that quite well in a hybrid environment. But and then we would come back as a group and discuss what it is they found, items that they found of interest, and what have you. And the advantage of a hybrid is they can show me what they're looking at. Like if they're looking at a record, they can show me screen cap. They're often using like an Amazon, it's not called Look Inside anymore, it's the reader sample where you could see the title page. So it actually worked quite well. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised. So hybrid, I think, is certainly, there's a lot of options we can explore.
Definitely. I think we can move on the Q&A part. Based on the Q&A we received, there seems kind of 8 or 9 questions. I don't know whether we will be able to cover all of them throughout the final 15 minutes or not. But for the part that we not be able to answer, I will post the related answers later on the NARDAC website. So the first question is, what's the panel view on the use of soft deprecated elements in implementation and therefore in training, particularly as these may later be removed entirely from the official RDA? Any panel members to answer the question?
Yeah, so I'll just take a quick stab at it. In my LIS course, we have had the occasional bibliographic example that we bring forward where there is on the title page clearly a presentation of a parallel title value to be recorded. So it is very much driven by examples based on real items from the collection. I think that there is value in showing these soft deprecated elements if they are likely to occur in an environment that the student is likely to graduate into. And as we are assuming that many students, if they obtain a cataloging kind of position or work with Canadian library institutions, they're most likely to encounter MARC-based data at this point. So yes, certain parallel fields will come up.
Yeah, I think teaching soft deprecated elements as a concept is vital. The toolkit is an integrating resource meant to work in a linked data interface, conceptual world, and soft deprecated elements are a part of that, as well as hard deprecated. And so from that viewpoint, you absolutely need to teach the concept and give some examples. From an implementation viewpoint, and this decision hasn't been made at all with any of the soft deprecated elements within the LC-PCC context, I personally would like us to not use them and shift to using the recommended elements and write the policy statements to allow for them to be avoided, because if they're soft deprecated now, my suspicion is eventually they will be hard deprecated. So I would prefer to anticipate them vanishing under us. And so from that viewpoint also, that would impact how I want to train them to understand, okay, let me teach you about this element that is soft deprecated, but hey, let me show you the options are over here to already cover what this tells you to do. And one day we're going to shift to those. So in that sense, I do want to teach them, but at the same time, I don't want to obsess about them. I want to teach them in the sense of this is how we're going to handle soft deprecation within our context.
Great. Our next question, do trainees feel that RDA Toolkit contains sufficient examples to illustrate the application of guidance? Do trainees understand the concept of soft deprecated elements? I think Louise or other panel members already answered part of the question with regard to how students feel about the examples in the RDA toolkits. Any more information here for the questions?
I'll just add from the PCC test of the official RDA toolkit, one of the comments I feel like we received a lot of was the need for people wanted more examples in the toolkit from what was already there.
So I think everybody agrees there aren't enough examples. I mean, everybody, including the examples group, agrees there aren't enough examples. One issue with examples is the isolatedness of them. I mean, which has also been the case with original RDA, is that they're just snippets and they do not actually have any context around them, and then so that's a training issue. But the quantity of examples, it's clear there aren't enough.
To answer the second question there, do trainees understand the concept of soft deprecated elements? Honestly, I haven't had a chance to teach that yet, so I don't know.
Okay, our next question, have folks found that the DCRMR or another metadata application profile has been a cost-effective and or intellectual portal to the RDA toolkit?
Haven't taught with it, so no context here.
I was just speaking with my department chair, pointing out something that had been pointed out to me, which surprised me, but now I realize it's true, that DCRMR is completely based on official RDA. So people who are implementing DCRMR have now implemented official RDA. And so that's a sort of a pat on the back you can give to people who are using that particular standard. If you follow DCRMR, you are doing official RDA. It does have an organization, so it's probably helpful to catalogers of rare materials, but they can believe and it's true that they have now implemented official RDA, and good for them.
And I think Adam Barron already mentioned about the application profile, the importance of application profile in the teaching part, which answer part of the question. It is a very effective tool with regard to the RDA toolkit teaching.
May I add one more comment about the
Sure.
application profile? So in the course that I co-teach at the University of Toronto, my co-instructor and I do have a teaching application profile that we give out to students, and we work with them through the process of consulting the application profile first, and then looking up the element page in RDA toolkits, finding the right instructions based on the recording method or the vocabulary encoding scheme that is referenced in the application profile. And then we also teach students to look up any additional commentary that's also instructed in that application profile. So we relate to students, this is not intended to be used outside of the course. This is just a tool developed to illustrate the purpose of an application profile and to give you some guidance. And I will say that in terms of being an instructor, I have actually found it much easier to root my training of RDA around an application profile when I think back to how I used to teach with the original RDA toolkit, which was just assigning a bunch of chapters in a very particular sequence that did not match the numerical order of the chapters. And students often came to me and told me they felt very overwhelmed and didn't know how deeply to read each chapter.
Our next question seems not a question, but a comment, also partially related to the application profile, is wonder whether it's more challenging because we know AACR2 with our legacy knowledge, we at one point are trying very hard to get away from thinking in terms of standard BIP records. So the attendee likes the idea of thinking about the description first and the recording the second, and then application profile helps translate those in the MARC record in a structured way of thinking. The next question is, why do they use examples that are for real bibliographic records? Why don't they use examples that are totally made up but show exactly what's trying to make it clear to the user. I assume that they here refer to the RDA Toolkit example, like writers using examples in the RDA Toolkit.
I'll give a partial answer based on my knowledge, but truthfully, I don't know that I have full answer to it. One is simply because we needed examples and those were quickly available. And a part of that too, and I'll speak of this as one who has been deeply involved in the underlying data framework of writing the policy statements. For the examples, they have a very specific format that they need to follow to present them in a controlled way within that data file format. And so the encoding of that is part of the slowdown as well. So I do know that they are, as Elisa had already mentioned, that they are gathering more examples, trying to figure out which ones that will fit in. But just to get some examples in, they started with the ones they had.
But I'd like to say that I think I'm not on the examples group. I'm not the examples editor or anything, so I don't know. I agree, however, with the idea that we should be using real examples and not made up examples. And one of the reasons I feel that way is that if we have to resort to finding made up examples for a guideline, well, why do we even have the guideline if we can't find a real life example of where this is needed? And so in my opinion, you know, it's harder to find real examples. Sometimes it would be easy to make up examples, but I agree with the idea that we should be attempting to find real examples for all of these things, because if we can't find a real example, well, what's the point of why do we even have this guideline, is my sort of thought about that.
The next question is about the language. The convoluted language has always been a problem, and one that people have refused to address. Are there any plan to ever address this? I'm not sure whether this panel may have the answer to
Well,
that.
Jamie has noted that he would like to answer this question
okay.
because the next comment is basically the same person.
Yeah. Jamie, you want to say something?
Sure. I'll also admit that I accidentally hit the answer live button. I didn't mean to. So I didn't really plan on answering this, but I will. We are, the RSC and myself are, and if you don't know me, I'm James Henley. I'm the director of RDA Toolkit, are very aware of people's concerns about the language, and we are happy to address them. You have to tell us where the problems are. We don't have the resources and time and money to do a complete rewrite like what happened with the original RDA Toolkit. We don't have that kind of luxury to do something like that right now. So on the toolkit, you will find a submit feedback button. Whenever you're in the toolkit, it's in the upper right in the blue banner. Click on that and say this, quote the section. You can do a copy and paste, say this section makes no sense, and then send it to us, and we'll try and see if we can fix it. This way we can see patterns of how because as someone noted, RDA is written in a very structured way, and we try to repeat phrases quite a bit and keep the language very structured for translators and machines and everyone involved. So this way, if we keep getting these kind of messages, if this is really confusing, this doesn't make sense, then we can look at it and assess it and make a change to the language that makes sense. I can't act on the language is convoluted. I know it is, but I can't just fix it. I need specific areas and need to be able to understand exactly where the problems are happening. So please use that submit feedback button. Every release we do, we make changes based on that submit feedback button, fix broken things or reword things and et cetera like that. So please use that submit feedback button when you get to a section that you find nonsensical, and we'll look at it and see what we can do.
We have 2 more questions. So let's see whether we can respond to them. How do you, it's about the copy cataloging. How do you train the copy catalogers to find accurate records? It seems like each library needs to do, create a details application profile and the documentation that they consult. Is it the best way to train them?
I can answer or start to answer this. And I think for me, it goes back to sort of what is your goal and what do you want the copy catalogers to be able to do? And I think having, whether you call it an application profile or some sort of procedure or documentation that is aligned with official RDA, but covers the steps that you want them to do, that seems the easiest way to have them cover it without having to delve into the RDA toolkit that they don't need to do for their job.
We have one final question. Should application profiles be created for each material type? Any thoughts, panel members?
I don't really think that there need to be completely separate ones. I do think there are some elements that are specific to certain specific formats, and therefore there probably need to be like sub-application profiles that address those specific elements and are not part of the general one. But a large majority of what we record applies to all formats. And therefore, I think there should be a base general application profile with little sub-pieces that address the specificity of certain elements.
Yeah, I just want to add, just from a public library perspective, I mean, we do produce documentation and manuals, usually around material types, collection, separations and organization and that sort of thing. Starting with, with at the item level. But it does make sense to do the same at the bibliographic level and to specify those things that are unique for each material type and, each type of resource and so on. So, I mean, this is already happening in libraries. I mean, we do have in-house manuals and guidelines and we do call those profiles as well. So to extend that out into bibliographic data is very useful. Ideally, though, it'd be great if we could get material that's shared by the community and work from that. Like definitely get those examples out there so we can adopt them and use them for our purposes in-house. And build our routines around that in terms of, validating the data, making sure all the records have the fields lined up correctly and so on, and that they match what's on the shelf. So.
Great. Okay, I think we hit our milestone. It's 5 o'clock. Representing NARDAC, I deeply appreciate all the participants and then also our panel members. Thanks a lot for your time and then being with us. And I'd say we're looking forward to meet you in person in the future in the ALA or in other meetings about the RDA work. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.